Hello, everyone. How are you? I see now people joining. The number is counting up. So welcome, everyone. We'll give you some seconds, up to a minute for everybody to join and have everybody on the call. We are very, very excited about this webinar today with Christian. I'll introduce him in a second, although he needs no introduction. But we'll do what's protocolary, and I'll give you some seconds. I wish I had some elevator music for all of you to wait alongside us. But yeah, welcome. It's amazing to be hopefully everybody rested after a summer season that is coming to a closure, and we have the opportunity today to discuss how to upgrade our budgeting skills. The budgeting season is already here, so good. Okay. Welcome, everyone, more officially now, without any elevator music. I'm very, very excited for today's webinar. I'm particularly excited because we have an amazing guest, and also we have like a hot topic that is very relevant for today, but also for the upcoming months. As you all know, budgeting season is our Super Bowl. It's prime time for finance folks. And I feel, we all do a good job in budgeting, but there is always an opportunity to supercharge it, to upgrade our game. And an amazing way to do it is through a scenario planning. So we come equipped today, and our amazing guest has an extensive experience in this topic with tips, actionable tips to upgrade your budgeting process through a scenario planning. I feel sometimes we in finance are a bit reactive with the scenarios. We wait until we get these questions, or maybe it's low frequency. We want to do them more often, but it doesn't really happen. Our models are not prepared for that. It requires a stakeholder management. So it's a number of things that, how do we move from reactivity to proactivity when it comes to a scenario planning? And, an amazing opportunity is to leverage the budgeting season, to make a scenario more relevant, more in our day-to-day. So this is the topic for today. Hopefully everybody is very excited. And we have the privilege today to have Christian Buddy with us. He needs no introduction again, but I'm gonna go through his bio for everyone's context. Christian is an accomplished FP&A expert with over a decade of leadership experience in multinational corporations and fast-growing tech startups. He spent none less than 11 years at Procter & Gamble and Unilever, where he led FP&A and accounting teams. After earning his MBA from NYU CERN, Christian transitioned to the tech sector and played a pivotal role in taking Squarespace public as an FP&A leader. Now an entrepreneur, Christian shares his FP&A expertise as the director of the Wharton School FP&A Certificate Program, which all of you should be checking, through his online courses and via LinkedIn, where he has over 100,000 followers, which is very impressive. It's so exciting to have you with us, Christian. Thank you much for joining.
I'm very excited to be here, Julio.
Cool. Well, let's jump into it. I know you have a lot to share with us, with the audience today. So let's kick off with some context and some of the preliminary questions, if you want. Cool. A first question that we have for you today is, how does a scenario planning differ from traditional budgeting and what if analysis, for instance?
Yeah, so first I want to explain what scenario planning is a bit for those of you who aren't as familiar with it. So it often gets confused with what if analysis. So what if analysis is essentially an analysis of what could happen, whereas scenario planning is about what's likely to happen. So what if analysis then is basically just a mathematical exercise where you look at, okay, if I'm changing my sales by 5%, what would that result in profits, right? For example, or if we increase our price by 10%, then overall revenues are likely to drop by 2% because of a reduction in purchases. it's a mathematical analysis, what if analysis, and it's not scenario planning. I would see it as a precursor, as a first step on the path to getting to true scenario planning. Because when you're doing scenario planning, you're actually looking at not just at all the possibilities that could happen, but at likely change. So how likely changes to major business drivers impact your business. Now, it's really a result of risk and opportunity analysis. And the idea is that you discuss the decisions that you would have to make if these, best case, worst case, other scenarios happen. You start discussing these decisions now when you have time, so that when the scenario happens, you're prepared. You've done the work, you laid the foundation, and you can really make sure that you respond in a better way. So to give you an example, what scenario planning looks like. Assume, you have reason to believe that one of your main competitors introduces a new product soon that will be maybe slightly even better than yours. And the impact on your business, then you estimate that it would be around a 30% drop of revenue in the first 6 months if you do nothing, right? But then there's one thing you could do. You could also lower your price to be seen as more attractive compared to your competitor. Let's say you lower it by 5%. And then you do the analysis and you find out that means we're likely going to see a drop of 20% in revenue. So less than if you do nothing. And the third scenario could be, well, if we spend 500,000 in R&D to make improvements to our product, then we should be able to compete in 1 year from now and catch up and make back what we lose. So you see from this example that it's much more than a mathematical exercise. Bringing it back to the original question of how does it differ from traditional budgeting? So in traditional budgeting, in the regular annual planning process, the team prepares a projection of sales and expenses. Then they challenge the inputs. They discuss it with the broader team. They have some back and forth because usually the first submission is never the one that gets done. But in the end, people agree on a number, right? A number for each of the metrics you're budgeting. The problem with that is that if you only prepare that one number, it will be wrong, right? No one has a magical crystal ball that helps them project, especially 6, 8, 10 months out, which is what you're doing in annual planning. Scenario planning, on the other hand, takes that significantly further because you're looking at how could the external drivers that we don't control, like what our competition is doing, what regulations are doing, what raw material prices are doing, and then discuss what you're doing in this situation and develop those scenarios. And as a result, you don't have to make the decisions in haste, and you are more prepared, and the budget just becomes more useful.
Kristen, thank you. Very insightful. Great to understand a bit better the difference between what if and a scenario planning. We sometimes find it confusing, right? And we think we are doing a scenario planning, but in reality, it's a simplistic, more kind of what if analysis, which is also good and has a purpose, right? But we are talking here about upgrading our game with proper scenario planning that prepares us better for the future and really future proofs our budget. I see more and more people joining. So, again, welcome everyone. And so that please drop your questions for Christian in the Q&A section, right? I forgot to say that before. We are allowing time towards the end of this webinar to answer your questions. Oftentimes we get too many, so apologies in advance if we cannot cover all of them. But I heavily encourage you to use the opportunity that we have Christian with us today to extract all the wisdom that you can. Okay, let's move on to the second question. Christian, what are the best practices for effective scenario planning in the context of the budgeting process?
Yeah, there are a few important things to consider. The first one is you need to limit the number of the scenarios. So you don't want to have 12, 15, 20 different scenarios, and that can be a challenge sometimes, because especially when the business isn't going as well, there's a lot of pressure on the finance team to figure out, okay, what are ways out of that, and on the leadership team as well, of course. And yeah, what you learn in school is that the more work you do, the better your results, right? If you want an A on your math test, you study as much as you can and you get everything correct, and you probably get an A on that math test. But business, oftentimes business is not like that, right? We need to really think about what are the scenarios that really matter, because if you give your leadership team 20 different scenarios, even if you worked all weekend and you have everything perfectly laid out, it's not going to necessarily make the decision making better, because they also will be overwhelmed. They won't have the time to really understand all the 20 different scenarios. And it also can show that maybe you don't understand the business well enough, right? Because you should be able to narrow it down. So it's really important to look at scenario planning from an 80-20 mindset. So 80-20 means that 20% of the drivers result in 80% of the impact on your business, right? And the impact on sales and profit. And you need to figure out what those 20% are, right? Those 20% of tactics that your competitors could be doing, or external factors like even headcount wise, are you going to be able to hire the people you need? How long does it take to hire them? Those are all scenarios to consider, but you need to narrow it down. And that's where it's worth it to spend the extra time, right? Not into creating 20 scenarios, but maybe drafting 20 possible ideas for scenarios, but then only really analyzing the, I would say, 3 to at most 7 to 10 scenarios, and really build them out. Because that's the next best practice. Limiting the number of scenarios is the first one. Second one is develop comprehensive stories. So I mentioned earlier the difference between what-if analysis and scenario planning. And the reason that it's so important to understand that is, if you treat scenario planning like a simple model, like a simple mathematical exercise that you can solve in Excel, then you're not going to get really the value from it that you need. It needs to be more than that. So you shouldn't just describe what you think will happen, but also how it happens and why you think it happens. And so to take it back to the example, your scenario is that our main competitor will launch a product that's slightly better. You need to take it a step further, and you need to actually be clear about, okay, what could they be doing? What are areas in our product where maybe we aren't best in class, right? Where we have missing features, let's say. And how could that give our competitors an angle, right? How could they exploit that? And if you do it that way, the story becomes much more granular, and you'll make sure that it's not just something on a piece of paper somewhere, but something that's actually connected to what's going on in the business right now. So that's the second one. The third best practice is avoiding extremes. That goes a bit hand in hand with the 80-20 approach, but I think it's important to mention that, because I see that sometimes that people create scenarios that sound scary, right? Let's say, there's a new regulation that makes what we're doing impossible, that completely destroys the market that we're in, or Apple launches the exact same thing for free on the iPhone, for example, right? And we go out of business because of that. Those are extreme scenarios. And it's actually important to discuss them, but that should be done separately from scenario planning. Because when you're doing scenario planning, you're actually building comprehensive stories. You're actually really going into the details. For those extreme cases, you can have them separately. Maybe you want to, include them in your annual report, for example, that you share externally. But they shouldn't be part of scenario planning, because scenario planning is really about the likely scenarios. And then lastly, and this is often overlooked, you need to try to test your assumptions. So taking it back to the example we discussed here, let's say, our competitor, we think our competitor comes with a slightly better product. And our response to that is making a tweak with one of our features that we can do quickly, that we can roll out quickly to the market. Ideally, now you want to test whether that actually can move the needle. So don't wait until the competitor comes with that change. See if you can roll out that feature, maybe invite some beta testers, share it with some customers with a small group, or roll it out in a small part of your market and see if it actually results in an uplift. You may end up then deciding, of course, to not wait until the competitor does something and do that proactively, right? But it's important to figure out a way how you can do something in the real world that shows you whether you're on the right path. Yeah, and so those are the 4 best practices. Again, just to recap, limit the number of scenarios, develop comprehensive stories, avoid extremes, and test your assumptions.
Love it. Kristen, thank you so much. Very comprehensive. Less is more, right? And the power of storytelling is oftentimes overlooked. I really liked a point that you made, and we find as well from our side and from what we see that the most successful finance teams are the ones closer to the business, of course, right? And in order for them to develop this powerful narrative around a scenario and a storytelling, you really need to be very close to the reality of the business. So following your example, if your competitor is launching a very powerful product, then yeah, you need to understand very well what that means at the product feature level. You need to understand what's going to be the dynamics that's going to unfold. So it's not just a random number in a calculation in a model. Is more understanding the reality, the foundational reality of your business, what your customers value, what are their preferences, what the product team is willing to launch. So getting very close to to sales, to product, to the foundational business. So that is where where finance becomes strategic and impactful. Well, thank you for sharing. Let's move to the next one, which is a very exciting one. And how do you come up with relevant scenarios as a finance leaders? We want to do scenarios. Where do we start?
Yeah, no, and that actually ties back to what you just said, is you need to develop a deep understanding of the business to come up with these scenarios. And I also want to emphasize here, a best-in-class finance team, FP&A team, actually comes up with the scenarios. It shouldn't just be reactive. It shouldn't just be the CEO telling the finance team, hey, why don't you run a scenario where a competitor launches this and this feature and it has this and this impact on revenue? No, ideally, because the thing is that the finance team has a unique perspective of the business. They they have access to data that no other function has, because they see everything, right? They see the operational data, ideally, they see how that translates into the financials. And so the finance team should challenge themselves to think about how can they come up with these scenarios. And that requires a deep understanding of the business. Now, what do I mean with a deep understanding of the business? You need to understand the company's goals, of course, right? That's the absolute basics. But then you also need to understand the strategies the company wants to use to reach those goals, then how those strategies translate to tactics for the different departments that drive the revenue. And then how do we measure success for each of these tactics? And how can you see that in the numbers? So how do you develop that understanding? There are a few approaches. First, I would recommend start with what you already know inside and out, the P&L, right? The profit and loss statement that you're working with, and go through each line item and consider, okay, do I know how this expense line item here contributes to the success of the company? What's the goal with each of these items? And then how do we define success, right? If you're looking at the marketing budget and you see a line for podcast advertising, for example, what's the strategy behind that? How do we define success? How do we measure success? And then you go through the P&L, and you will find that probably there are some line items where you can't say that. And then that's your trigger to talk to the operations, to talk to the marketing manager, to talk to sales, to talk to R&D, to figure out, okay, how do strategies translate to tactics and how are they being measured? And then when it comes to sales, you need to understand, okay, what are the current trends and seasonalities we see in each revenue line item? Why do these trends and seasonalities exist ideally? And then how do your business partners in marketing, in sales, what do they do that helps them capitalize on these trends or helps ideally accelerate those trends? And then how does that get measured? Of course, really, really important. So that's the first one, link financials with operations. The second way to build business understanding is follow the variance. So if you're working in finance, that's something that all of us are doing is you've done your forecast, the new actuals come in, you compare actuals versus forecast, and you probably also compare actuals versus the prior month, the last year. Everybody looks at, okay, what happened? But you need to challenge yourself to take it a step further, understand why do things happen? What's the root cause, right? That requires digging into the numbers. And then not just what's the root cause, but what's the impact on the business going forward, and then discussing that with the teams, with the broader team. It's number two. The third one is democratize data. So what do I mean with that? Well, so these days, for finance to deliver more value, and especially the kind of value we're talking about here, developing scenarios proactively, you need to have access to more data than just what you can get out of the accounting system. You need to understand the operational metrics. For example, how many leads are we getting? How are we scoring those leads? What quality do those leads have? Because those data points can serve as leading indicators. They can tell you something about the future before it gets reflected in your sales and in your profit data. And that means you need to have access. I mean, first of all, you need to know what those metrics are, but then you should also ideally get access. Those data points shouldn't be siloed and just the marketing team's purview, or just the sales team, just the R&D team, because then ideally you can start connecting dots. You can start looking at, okay, how do what I see in the accounting system change and according to the changes I see in the operational data? Then ideally you find correlations, and that can help you come up with that can help you develop your business understanding. And then the last one is mingle. That's such an important aspect of how you can improve your business understanding, is just try to have more touch points with people. And that can be professionally, where you're asking to join operational meetings that they already have, you're on the fly on the wall, and hopefully then later you'll add value by asking questions, by helping people look at issues from different point of views. But it could also be as simple as asking the head of marketing to go for lunch, right? Or the head of R&D, the head of sales. And that way learn more about the business. So to recap, the 4 ways that help you develop your business understanding quickly are: first, linking the financials with operations and understanding that, following the variance, doing deeper variance analysis, democratizing data, making sure you have access to operational data, and then mingle. So talk to your business partners.
Kristen, thank you so much. So insightful. Lots of actionable tips to start, throwing those meetings into the calendar and, getting deeper into performance analysis. A lot of actionable recommendations there. Let's move to the next question. That is, I'm particularly excited about this one, and I'm sure it's going to be a blast. Because driver-based planning is also something that, close to our hearts. So how does driver-based planning relate to a scenario planning?
Yeah, it's a great question. So But driver-based planning essentially means connecting business drivers with likely financial outcomes. It's one of my favorite forecasting methods because it combines it. It necessitates a deep understanding of the business, but it's translated then into a model that is easy to understand and that is easy to update throughout the year. And I think actually the best way is to explain it is if I show you an example of what that looks like. So let me share my screen here. Oh, I'm actually currently unable to share the screen. If maybe they can enable that in the back end. Just have to get the permission to share the screen. And while they're setting that up, I can already talk a little bit about what you're going to see in this example here. So driver-based planning means you look at what are the possible things that can impact your business, right? And what plans do you have in the next year to significantly change your business? So that could be, for example, investing more in marketing. What's important here to consider is it's not just increase marketing expenses by 20% and then your sales increase by 5%. It needs to be more detailed than that. You need to go a level deeper. And okay, now I can share my screen and I'll show you what that looks like. Can you see my screen?
It's great. Yeah.
Perfect. So this is an example of a driver-based plan from a SaaS company, a software as a service company. It's actually very similar to a company that I used to work at, of course, with different numbers, different scenarios. But how it works is, okay, so these are the actual subscriptions of the last year. This is what we're forecasting, the subscriptions of the next year. And then here in the middle, you have the business drivers. And I mentioned that they have to be detailed. So here, for example, we're saying, well, we're investing into TV advertising, which will show our brand to more people. So we hope that people will recognize what our brand more frequently. So that's what unaided awareness increase means. And we expect that then this results in 288,000 additional subscriptions. We also have invest more in our direct response budget. That's the part of the marketing budget where you're hoping that people take action right away. So buy now buttons, right? But there are also negative impacts. We expect that inflation increases, which will lower, the money that people have available for subscription like that. We may also have to increase the price. And so then there's an impact here, a new promo strategy. What happens when there's we do nothing, and something related to the COVID pandemic. And what's important to note here is that those are not just numbers that are taken out of thin air. For example, when I did this at the company I used to work at, we actually had a data scientist on the team, and they looked at the survey data from unaided awareness, and they looked at the sales data in the same quarter and with some lag, and they did a complex regression analysis to come up with that number. So now, how does that link with scenario planning? Well, typically what you do when you do driver-based planning, you don't just do one scenario. You do you at least have a conservative and an aggressive scenario. And you do that for each of the drivers. Sometimes it could be as easy as saying, well, we just increase it by 20% plus or minus, or sometimes it could be a lot of math going on in the background and a deep analysis to see, okay, what would a conservative scenario look like? What would have to be true in the business for this to happen? And when you do this, that has a few advantages. So for example, let's say, you consolidate the budget, you calculate how much for 4 million subscriptions, how much does that mean in terms of profit? And you realize, it falls short of investor expectations, right? It's not the number you need. That's a common scenario. I think if any of you listening here have done budgeting before, that happens frequently, that the first submission is not the final one you end up going with. And so then you can say, well, when it comes to unaided awareness increase, we're actually confident that the aggressive scenario is within reach, and here's why. But when it comes to the direct response budget, we really don't think we can do more here. We didn't even increase the number because, we've done a lot of this in the past. We have good data, and we know, we know exactly what to expect. Inflation, we can also be more aggressive, but not with the others. And then you can quickly add up what the new number will be just by adding those scenarios. And what's nice about this is then later on when you have your board meeting and you get the question of, okay, so great, you're meeting our expectations for next year, but how risky is this? Then you can answer the question and you can say, well, out of the 6 business drivers that we're looking at, we had to move 2 of them to the aggressive scenario, and here's why, and here's our thinking behind that. So you can quantify the risk and you can have a deep understanding of, okay, how much risk are we going to take? That's another big advantage of doing driver-based planning and scenario planning. And I hope you can tell why I see this as one of my favorite forecasting techniques.
Kristen, thank you so much. I love this example. Of course, driver-based planning and driver-based forecasting is of essence in any FP&A and finance team. And we definitely encourage all of our customers to follow best practices here. And I think the beauty of this is how you connect that with the scenario planning and how those drivers can turn into a very illustrative story to share to your management team, to share with your board. So what are the risks that we are assuming to meet that number? Where of our assumptions are more aggressive? What is the sensitivity? And it allows the management team to have more clarity, which is overlooked, clarity around what truly matters in the business. When people are budgeting, like the noise goes through the roof. There is a lot of numbers, a lot of versions, and among all that chaos that we typically see in the budgeting season, having that clarity that you just showed, very simple business conversation. This is what we are assuming. This is what it takes to meet our targets. I think it's beautiful. I think it's beautiful. This is the beauty of simplicity and connecting driver-based planning with the scenario planning. So thank you for sharing that example. Cool. Let's move to another questions, and I'm very excited to see many questions actually in our private Q&A section and also in the general chat. So please keep them coming. We are allowing for some time towards the end to go through them. So don't be shy. Don't be shy and share your questions. Let's move to the next one that we had ready for Christian. What should you do if the other departments aren't eager to collaborate, which feels to me the 1 million question sometimes.
Yeah, so collaboration is extremely important when it comes to annual budgeting, right? So if it's just a finance exercise, then you're simply not getting the depth you need for the budget to be useful later on when variances to actuals increase. And I really like the quote, "Plans are nothing, but planning is everything." I don't know if you heard that before. It's by it's attributed to former US President Eisenhower. Plans are nothing, but planning is everything. And the reason I like it is because really it's not about the numbers you produce in the budgeting process is not the most important thing, right? Because the numbers, they will be off. Even if you do follow the scenario planning best practices that we discussed here, there's still going to be a lot of things happening in the business that you couldn't foresee, of course. That's just the way it is. But if you focus on the planning process and you make sure that you bring in, the cross-functional team, you make sure that you get bottom-up inputs from them and compare them to your top-down, that's how you can make the budget process useful. Because if you have that depth, then later on, when you look at the variances, you actually can learn something from them. And you can say, well, okay, we're now in March, our sales are 5% below budget. Let's drill down into which of the 20 assumptions we had going into this, which of them were wrong, right? And then we learn something from why they were wrong, and it improves our accuracy going forward. The important part here is that you need both. You need a top-down that finance can create, can look similar to the driver-based forecast I just shared. And you need a bottom-up budget from the teams. So each function that contributes to revenue growth needs to be involved and needs to share their understanding of the business, because then you can compare the top down to the bottom up. They will not match, right? Usually the top down is more conservative. The top down is more aggressive and the bottom up is more conservative. Why? Well, the people who are on the hook to deliver the numbers are usually, they want to keep the expectations lower, right? So they can exceed the expectations. So then, understanding now the importance of getting this cross-functional collaboration, the question was, what should you do if other departments aren't eager to collaborate, right? If they aren't willing to put in the time. And of course, you need to be clear, it is a big ask, because if you do planning correctly, I mean, it comes in addition to what they already have on their plate. Usually people also tend to be a bit more busy towards the end of the year because you have to hit the number, people are looking at the numbers very closely. So what can you do? Well, first, it's really important to have transparency in the process. So sometimes people are hesitant to share data with finance because they don't know how it's being used, right? People give up a bit of control when they share their risks that they see in the business with finance. And so it's important to be transparent about what are you going to do with the data, in which way are you going to share it, right? Are you going to share all the details? Are you sharing it consolidated? Are you adding your own opinion to the numbers? If you do, that's fine, but then you should share it back with the leaders you got it from before it goes to the CEO of the company, right? Before it goes to the board of directors. And because you want your business partners to have ownership in the numbers. You want them to know that what they're submitting, it will be passed on, that they'll have a voice, right? That you're not completely changing everything and then it's a different number. That's number one. The other one is you need to make it meaningful. So you need to make sure that people understand that you're doing this budgeting process because it will help them make better decisions. And you explain, hey, here's how we're doing scenario planning. Here's all the best practices we're following. And all of this has the only objective to make your life easier, right? To make it easier for you to hit your number, make it easier for you to exceed expectations. And then the other one is see if you can give people something they want, right? Oftentimes what people want, what leaders, department heads want, is more flexibility, right? More flexibility in decision making. And you can tell them that, hey, if you participate in this budgeting process, if you give me detailed assumptions, then we'll have a better understanding of the business. We lower the risk in a way because we can make proper projections. We can act now to be ready for a best case, for a worst case. And in turn, because we lowered the risk that way, we can give you more flexibility in your spending. We can give you more wiggle room. We can even put buffers in the budget, that we both agree on, that you don't even have to tell me yet what you're going to do with the money, but it's here for you in case something comes up, right? In case there is an opportunity that you need to jump on quickly. That can be part of the budgeting process as well. And that way, yeah, you're giving people something in return for them spending their time on the budgeting process. And of course, the last one, maybe the most important one to encourage collaboration, is you need to get support from the top. because what you want to avoid is that the finance team is running against the wall. They're going to their sales business partner and they send them the templates, and the sales business partners always come up with excuses why they don't have time or why they had to prioritize something else. That can be simply due to the fact that their plate is already full and their leadership didn't tell them why budgeting matters, and they didn't, make that a priority for them. So oftentimes the easiest way to get more collaboration is to make sure that the leadership team are all on the same page about the process, about what you're going to do. And, that's not finger pointing. That's not something you do after the fact. It's something you do at the very beginning of the budget process, because often people maybe underestimate what it takes. Maybe they have never done a full-fledged budgeting process. And what that means, by the way, running a full-fledged budgeting process, I've just recently launched a new online course, leading the budgeting process. So we can put the link in the chat for that later, so people can learn more about it there.
Awesome, Christian, thank you so much. I really like this approach that you're flagging, where finance has most of the impact is not behind the desk, right? Even if you want to build an amazing model full of drivers and scenarios, ultimately for that to make sense, it all comes down to staying very close to the business, to making yourself relevant for the business, giving them something first, becoming relevant in exchange for the information that you need afterwards. And I would add that, we need to start early. So, showing up last minute doing budgeting with, fire on your hands. Yeah, I need to complete the budget, and that's not the best way to kick off a partnership. So nurturing that quarter in, quarter out, setting up that foundation is gonna, give you the success you need during budgeting. Awesome.
Actually, a really good point. You need to start early, and maybe a tip for that for people, because sometimes it can be a challenge to encourage people to start early, right? Because they have a lot on their plate, and deadlines are usually how people make prioritization decisions in business, right? They already have a lot of deadlines from the boss, and then finance has additional deadlines. And so if you want to make sure that people actually start early, what I would recommend is have more than one deadline for your budget. So have a first pass deadline and then a second pass deadline. The first pass deadline is a few months out, or maybe 1 month out, when you actually have to have your board meeting, have to have the final budget. And then of course you don't just ask people for the numbers for no reason. You actually do have a review meeting after that. You do share it with the leadership team, but that can work wonders, to have these two deadlines rather than just one, a week, 2 weeks before the board meeting, because then it can often happen that people just wait until the last minute with their work. So yeah, really, really good point.
Thank you. And of course, budgeting is critical, right? But once budgeting finishes and the budget is in place and approved by the board, then the new year starts. And then oftentimes we find that the budget becomes old and stalled very quick when we see variances actually increasing to actuals, right? And then you see that deviation. So my question to you, Christian, is how can you make sure that your budget stays relevant even when those variances in fact increase?
Yeah, so I touched on this already a little bit beforehand. The key is to make sure that the work that goes into the budget is collaborative. You're getting those bottom-ups from the teams. You're getting those deeper assumptions. That's step number one. And then step number two is to do proper variance analysis. What do I mean with proper variance analysis? You need to get the what, the why, and the so what from your variance analysis. So to give an example, let's say for professional fees so you do your variance analysis and you find out that professional fees are 100,000 higher than budgeted. that's your variance, right? And then the simple analysis would be, well, you look into the numbers and you say, well, it's 100,000 higher because Deloitte, our auditor, that bill was higher than we had budgeted. A lot of finance teams stop there. But if you stop there, you're leaving a lot of value that you can add on the table. Because if you do more digging, you may find out that the reason that auditor bill is higher was not that the audit was more complex, they spent more hours. That the reason was actually that they increased their price. And that's a true root cause. Now you really have the so what, because then you can say, well, they increased the price. Maybe we should look at doing a tender. Maybe we should look at changing our auditor to see if we can get a better price for that service. And if you stop at the higher level where you say, well, okay, we missed because our auditors were more expensive, you don't have that opportunity to actually recommend a decision. And this is also a good example to show again how important it is to have the depth in the analysis. Because if it was just the finance team who did the budget, maybe they looked at, okay, what was our auditor? How much did we pay the auditor last year? How much are we paying it? And then they just made a projection based on how we paid last year. But if they instead would have talked to the business team, maybe procurement or someone who is actually who manages that contract, they could have told them what the price was and how many hours went into that. And when you have that level of detail, you can make recommendations like I just said, where you say, hey, we should maybe do a tender and look at a cheaper provider with a better price. Yeah, so I hope that illustrates it. And then you can actually say, well, okay, we have a significant variance between our budget and our actuals, but it's not necessarily a bad thing because we can explain it and we can learn from it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Christian. Through root cause analysis and helping the business or other support functions make better decisions, informed decisions. I also think to this point that getting into reforecasting, very often reforecasting helps you not necessarily make your budget relevant, but still based on the learnings and the partnership that you cemented during the budgeting season, then you are able through the reforecasting cycle, hopefully monthly, hopefully rolling, right, very often, stay very relevant, very current to the business. So that's another way of indirectly, elongating a little bit the power and the work that has been done in the budgeting season. Good. Well, I'm very excited now because we left almost 15 minutes, 13 minutes now to the Q&A from the audience. And I've been peeking here at some of the questions. So we'll be Christian, throwing them at you, and let's offer some insights to the audience. I'm going to start with one of the latest ones, actually, that I have here handy. What best practices would you suggest for sales and marketing budget? I feel like this one is the hardest to budget, and more than often drives majority of the BDA.
Yeah. So sales and marketing budgets, one of the questions I would start with is looking at talking to your marketing business partner and say, hey, what is something that you're thinking about changing going into the next year? So what are things that worked well that you're going to continue to be doing to drive leads and sales? And what is something new that you're going to do next year? And that could mean trying a new marketing channel, trying a new way to approach leads, or it could be significantly reducing investments into one marketing budget and increasing it into another. Now, ideally, you don't just ask the question and then hope to get a good answer. Ideally, you've done your homework before and you looked at how marketing is spending the money on a much more granular level than you see from the accounting system. So you look at how much are they spending on YouTube ads, on Google ads, on, on that level of detail. And ideally, even a level further where you say, okay, we're spending 50,000 on Google ads. How many views did we get from that? How many clicks did we get? What was the cost per click? How did it change over time? That information should ideally you get that information. Not, it's good to have access to the systems, but there should be some reporting that the marketing team did internally that maybe haven't shared with the finance team before, that you can reference there. And when it comes to sales, it's similar. If you're in a B2B situation where you have a sales team that reaches out to other companies, take a look at that funnel, right? Take a look at how many opportunities do you have early in the funnel, how many opportunities do you have late in the funnel. And then how you can frame the conversation is, well, two questions. What are you going to do differently next year to get more leads at the top of the funnel? And what are you going to do differently to increase your conversion rates, to increase the likelihood that they will move through that funnel and get to the next step and then hopefully become a customer? So it really comes down to asking those questions. And then when you have answers to those questions, it's your job to translate that into financials.
Thank you, Christian. It's a very complex one, right? So we could do 1 or 2 webinars only focused on
Yes.
marketing, budgeting, and forecasting, but really, really good and clear, succinct answer, going at the core of those questions. Let me follow up with another one. It seems like risk management, there are 2 questions related to this. It seems like risk management and scenario planning for budgeting can be integrated. Have you observed this in your career or consulting, Christian?
Absolutely. So risk management, it depends a bit on which industry you're in. In many cases, the finance team plays a big role in risk management. In other industries, there's a separate risk and compliance team. But in those situations where the finance team plays the role, yeah, so driver-based planning is a great way to start getting a better handle of risk, because you're at least on the risk that's in your forecast, right? It's in your budget, because you can talk about, well, if we go with just a conservative scenario, this would be where the business lands. If we move this, and this driver to aggressive, this is where the business lands. And that then gives you an understanding of what is that range of possible outcomes. And then you can have a detailed conversation about, okay, how likely actually is that? Not how likely that all of the drivers go to the aggressive scenario. You have to be more detailed. You have to go driver by driver and get an understanding there. And the other way you can understand risk better with scenario planning is comparing that top down to the bottom up. I mentioned that briefly, but if finance does a proper top down, then they can have a very, very different conversation, and then compare that to the bottom up they get from the business. It's a completely different conversation than if they don't do the work up front, go to the business partner and say, hey, your assumptions there for the lead next year, they look a bit low. Why are they so low, right? That's not good. You don't want to ask questions like that. It should be grounded in data. Instead, you should say, well, I've done this top down. Here are my assumptions. Here's my numbers for leads. It's 20% higher than your number. Why don't we compare assumptions and we figure out where do they differ? And that can then tell you something about risk, because that then opens the door to your business partner opening up and saying, oh yeah, but I didn't tell you yet that there's this bad news that we just got, and that will significantly impact leads for next year. And then you can uncover those risks and you can make them transparent.
That's great. The differences between top and bottom up planning is where the magic happens and where the truly fruitful conversations take place. Thank you for that. I have another question here related to, not exactly about the scenario planning, but I thought it was very interesting in the context of the budgeting season and risk management. What is your view and the best practice in terms of buffers and having, let's say, contingency funds and so on?
Yeah, that's a great question, because So buffers sometimes get a bad rep, right? And sometimes buffers get a bad rep for a good reason. So for those of you who don't know, a buffer is where you say, the budget for next year is the marketing budget for next year is $100,000, and you got a bottom up for $90,000, and the team knows exactly what they're going to do that. But we're putting a buffer of 10,000 because could be many reasons, right? It could be because you know they have tendency to overspend, and so you want to make sure that that doesn't happen. And then on the sales side, you could say, well, investors expect us to grow by 5% next year, but we can only come up with concrete plans to grow by 4%. So this 1% there is it's actually not called a buffer. It's often called then a go-get, but it's kind of the same thing, where you say, well, we don't yet know how to close that gap, but we'll include it in the forecast for now. And as we go through the year, we continually reduce that. Same thing with the buffer and expenses. As you go through the year, you want to continually reduce that. Now, where buffers are bad is when there's no transparency about them. So let's say the marketing manager who is responsible for podcast advertising again says, oh, I don't know, maybe more people will download the podcast than I expect. Let's just add the number by 10%. And then the marketing director also didn't know about this, but thinks, oh, last year we spent more on podcasting than we thought. Let's add another 10%. But they also don't tell finance because they're afraid that if they tell finance, finance will take away the buffers. And then finance adds another buffer because they look at the same number. So, and then the number just becomes completely unrealistic. And so what's important when it comes to buffers, the most important thing is that you're transparent, you're sharing it, and you can, if you finance, you can only get people to share those buffers if they trust that you allow it, right? If they trust that you don't take them away. And it actually is, I would argue, good business practice to have buffers because you never know what surprises are happening. And there are these unknown unknowns, right? The things that you don't know about that can happen. And you need to buffer for them. And you also want to be able that your team is able to capitalize opportunities quickly without having to always go through a long approval process. So I'm a fan of buffers as long as they are transparent.
Thank you. Very clear. I think we will have time to a couple of last questions. So let's compress them. One of them is, if I'm transparent to the sales and marketing function with the buffers that I give them, then they will spend it, right? So I think that's a great follow-up comment from James, who both put the question forward. And a question from Logan now is, VPs sometimes want more and more scenarios. What's your advice on pushing back against new scenarios if you already have 3-5 of them? Some practical advice there in terms of managing the next question, the next what if sometimes, or even a scenario.
Yeah, great question. So yeah, I mean, leaders are curious, right? They want to be able to understand, okay, but what if this happens? What if that happens? Sometimes they also get information earlier, and they have a lot of experience, so they may be more, they may know better. Ideally, what you want to do is that make it possible so that they can change the scenarios themselves and tweak the numbers themselves. You know, ideally, you know, Julio knows a lot more about this, but if you have an FP&A software where the leaders can go in themselves and change the scenarios and change the numbers, that's the way to do it, because then they can spend all the time they want in creating additional scenarios, different ways to look at the numbers, and they don't take up the resources of the finance team.
And this is related to some of the questions that we received. John was asking, what software do you recommend for a scenario planning? And of course, I have a recommendation, but still, I leave it for you. Yeah, so in terms of a scenario planning, look, you can get it done with a spreadsheet, or you can get it done via a native solution. It is my opinion that having a solution, an FP&A solution that is advanced, there you need to make sure you are getting into something that is not entry level, because that's going to be more shallow, right? So you need to make sure they have a advanced modeling engine that can handle multidimensionality very well at performance with high volumes of data. That's very important, right? This is what's going to make your scenario shine and not fall short. And that's going to be, streamlining a lot your capacity to run a lot of scenarios, right? Because you will have your operational model, and then you will have different scenarios. Those scenarios will be connected automatically. So if you make a change in your base case, you can push that change to other scenarios. That's more difficult to get done in spreadsheets, and so on and so forth. There is a lot of functionality there that makes a scenario planning, feel way smoother than what otherwise you will be able to do.
Yeah,
But that's
100%
another.
agree. And it's
Yeah.
not just that, it's also the consolidation process that can be super, super simplified if you have this tool. Because if you're just dealing with a bunch of Excel sheets for all these iterations I mentioned, it can be very difficult to manage. So yeah, I recommend that every finance team takes a look at these FP&A tools and looks at what's the best fit for them.
But Kristen, thank you so much. We are on time, and I had a blast, as always. It was such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for sharing all your extensive experience and your knowledge. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Julio. I really appreciate it. I had a lot of fun. And yeah, great discussion. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you so much. And for everyone, we'll be coming with more content, and also make sure you check Kristen's courses. The link is on the comment section here. He's working very closely with Wharton and some other online materials. So make sure you also check that out. Good. Thank you so much, everyone. It was great having you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.